Hello and welcome back. Welcome to the third installment of Loom-in-essence, where we delve into the world of experimental loom-based beadwork. I am your host, Maverick. All right, if you missed any of the previous videos in this project, I will leave a link for you in the description below, but for everybody else, let's get down to business. So in this video, first I'm going to introduce the concept for the piece and talk about the theme. Then I'll go into the construction and the journey of creating it. And at the end, I'll talk about some of the takeaways and how I'll be applying what I've learned going forward in subsequent pieces. So this piece is actually part of a series of 3 looms that are connected not just thematically, but physically, and together create a larger piece called The Other Side. And as the name alludes, the other side is about the so-called death experience from the perspective of the so-called living, which would be us. So the death experience is something that I have been interested in from a young age, not really in a morbid way, just more in a curious way, as children are. And I had an experience early on in life that really intensified this curiosity for me. So this one night I had gone to a yoga class and I was on my way home and I was walking home from the bus stop, and I live in Canada. And so it was November, and in the winter time, our days are pretty short, so it gets dark early. So I was walking home, it was dark, and I had my Discman with me. I was listening to music, and I remember that as I passed the street lamp, the light flickered, and that sort of punctuated the moment for me. It just drew my attention into the present moment, and suddenly I became aware of the details of this moment. And so I remember I was listening to this Interpol album, and the song that had just started playing was titled Say Hello to the Angels, okay? So here I am listening to this song, Say Hello to the Angels, walking down this dark street, approaching an intersection. And I had the right of way, I had the walking man sign, so I started to cross the intersection. And as I was doing this, there was some traffic coming parallel to me, which is quite normal. But there was this car that was coming pretty quickly, and instead of going straight, this car decided to turn left. Now, of course, I was in their way, but I guess they didn't see me. And so I remember there was this split second where I knew this car was coming, but I realized, oh my God, they're not gonna stop. And they didn't stop. So I got hit and I went flying through the air. I tumbled over their vehicle. Like, I got knocked out of my shoes, my Discman, all my things went flying. I ended up on the side of the road. Now, long story short, I did not die. At least I didn't die here. If you believe in the multiverse theory, you could assume that there might be versions of reality where I did die, but here I am. So in this version of reality, I'm still here. But this moment in my life, this experience has always stood out to me as a point where I could have died, or I may have died. And so I spent like the last many years reading a lot about near-death experiences and listening to people's experiences, listening to audiobooks, YouTube videos, podcasts, you name it. I've probably listened to dozens, maybe even hundreds of different experiences. And so I decided to create a piece of artwork that was a exploration of these near-death experiences that people have. And it was also a way for me to process my own grief. I had a family member who passed away earlier at the beginning of this project, and so that's been a theme that's been woven into my work. Now, as I said earlier, this piece, The Other Side, consists of 3 pieces, 3 looms, the first of which is called The Void. Now, the void is an aspect of the near-death experience that is experienced by some, but not all, and it can be characterized by a darkness, a blackness, a total absence of light. For some folks, this is a very peaceful, loving experience, and for others, it can involve fear or even feelings of isolation. It really depends on the person going through the experience, which I suppose you can say about life as well. But one of the reasons I felt like it was very important to include this in my artwork is because I felt like it also symbolized the death experience from the perspective of the living. So when you think about death, it's shrouded in mystery. It is so unknown. There is so much about death that we don't understand and we don't know yet. And I guess you could say we are in the dark. And so I felt like this was the perfect piece to capture both the experience of the living and also of those who have had these near-death experiences. Now let's switch gears, and I want to talk about the construction of the piece, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the technical direction and some of the challenges that came up. For the last piece, I worked with the technical theme of loom outside the box, which entailed constructing frames that were non-square, non-rectangular, non-box-like in shape. So for this next piece, in fact, for all three pieces part of the other side, I will be continuing in this direction. However, I'm going to be narrowing my focus to working specifically with angles and more triangular shapes. And since I'm going to be doing this with each of the three pieces, the aim is to adapt and refine my techniques with each iteration and to also add other layers of complexity. And here's the piece of wood that I'm going to be using to create all three looms. And you can see that there are branches that are protruding at different angles, and that's what's going to create the real technical challenge for this piece. Now, at this point, the wood has already been prepared to start building the looms on, which means that it has dried out to a certain point, and the bark has been removed, and I've applied a few layers of sealant. You'll notice that the branches do have some cracking that's happening. Now, that is something that occurs naturally with the wood as it dries out. Different layers of the wood dry at different rates, which results in the cracking. But this piece is actually much more sturdy than it looks. And for the purposes of this artwork, it's definitely strong enough since it's not going to be load bearing or have a lot of tension or pressure on it. Well, surprise, surprise. The first piece I started working on for the other side was not the void. But it is the first piece I finished. So here's what happened. I actually started out working on one of the larger pieces, and I started out in a similar way to what I did with the last piece, where I used beads as anchors to space out the warp threads. Then I did do some experiments with attaching the warp threads. I tried a different method. I didn't love how it turned out, so I scrapped that. I defaulted back to what I did last time because it had worked well. And I was on my way. I used a single thread to create all the warp threads for this piece, and it took me days. It took me days of just working for hours of attaching these warp threads, but it was worth it as far as I could tell. And then came the part where I tried to sew the first row of beads on, and it did not go well. It was kind of devastating, to be honest, after spending so much time and energy getting to that point. But as it goes with experimental work, regardless of what field you're in, sometimes you try something out using the knowledge and the tools and the experience that you have, and sometimes it doesn't work. And that was the case here, unfortunately. So this felt like a major setback at this point, but I had to figure out what to do next. So what went wrong? Well, let's have a look. Here you can see that I have some major buckling going on. So much so that the entire row of beads is rippling. Now, at this point for me, it was pretty evident that I didn't have enough room between my warp threads to accommodate the height of my beads. But why? Because I had used the same beads that I was using in the loom to create the anchors for the warp threads. So the anchors determine the spacing for the warp threads, so it should work, right? Wrong. Wrong, 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 wrong. And why is it wrong? Spoiler alert, it's those angles. So think about it like this. If you have two sides that are parallel, okay, and you attach two threads connecting those two sides, so two imaginary threads, okay? Now let's say there is a height of 1 inch between those two threads. While the sides are parallel, that distance of 1 inch is maintained. But now if you start to change the angle of those two sides and they're no longer parallel, the more you open up that angle, the more you're going to compress the distance between your two threads. And if you think about it, if you opened up the angle all the way to a 180-degree angle, so it's completely flat, the distance between those two threads is going to be non-existent, right? Those threads are going to be on the ground. No more room between them. So this is essentially what had happened to me. My anchor beads were attached to those sides, and now they were also on an angle. And so my warp threads were getting compressed, which meant that my beads did not fit. So at this point, I was going to have to do it again. But before doing it again, I decided to stop working on this larger piece and to work on the void, which was a smaller piece, so that I could do some experiments and work out the details before applying that to a larger piece, so that I would know it was going to work and I wouldn't put in all that work only to be disappointed again. So let's talk about the void. Now, as I said before, the void is characterized by darkness. So I knew that I wanted to use black beads for this point, for this piece, but there's so many different kinds of black beads. So I had already decided I was going to use delicas, but I decided to use matte black beads instead of opaque black beads because the opaque beads are shinier and they reflect light more, which is obviously not going to work with my theme. So because the matte black beads are more absorbent of light, I thought that they would be a better fit for this piece, and that's what I ended up using. For the construction for the void, I decided that before I did anything else, the first order of business was to take measurements. So I started out by measuring some of the different beads that I had that I could use potentially as anchor beads. Then I took some measurements of the wood and I determined how much taller my anchor beads had to be compared to the other beads I would be using for the design of the loom. And I made these calculations based on the angles of the wood, which is probably the most important part in all of this. After that, I decided to run a couple different experiments. And since this piece was smaller, it would be fairly easy to do that. So the first experiment I did was using 2 different beads. I alternated a larger bead and a smaller bead. And I also, when I attached them to the sides, I attached them a little bit more loosely than I normally would. Usually I would go as snug as possible. But for this trial, I tried to leave a little bit of space to see how that would work out. Now, once I had attached the warp threads and I started looming on that, I did notice that my spacing was still a little off. I had a bit too much space. And so I was getting light leaks, and also because I hadn't attached the anchors as snugly, there was a little bit of movement, which may not seem like a big deal for such a small piece, but when you translate that into a larger piece, I might run into some difficulties. So I didn't love it for the reasons I mentioned. I also just didn't love the look of it because I found that I had used the same color beads for the anchor beads as in the design. And because I was working with a triangle, I was having some space between the anchor beads and the design beads because it's not square and the beads are kind of square. So I decided that it would look better if I used clear beads on the side, and I ended up loving that look. So for the next experiment, I did use clear beads, and I used actually seed beads that they're 29% taller than the beads I'm using in the design, which seems like a lot, and they definitely were a little bit more large than I needed, but this is what I had on hand, and it worked well enough that I was pretty pleased with it, and I decided to go forward with that. So here it is in all its glory. And you can see that the Toho beads I used on the sides are a little bit large, and that's why I have this crescent-shaped depression along the top edge of the loom. But that's something I can live with. It was more important for me to pull the loomed beads as tight as possible to prevent light leaks for this piece because it is the void. But for the next piece that I work on, which is larger, the angle is a little bit different. and I'm not going to be as concerned about light leaks, so that won't be a problem for that piece. So at this point, I'm happy with how this has turned out, and I'm going to call it a success, even if it took a while to get here. So let's talk about what I learned. The major takeaway from all of this was take your measurements. That and math is your best friend. So working on this smaller piece definitely gave me the opportunity to figure out how to work with angles, how to adjust my process in order to accommodate different angles. I learned the relationship between the distance between the warp threads and the angle of my frame, and also how to calculate how much longer or how much taller my anchor beads need to be in relation to my loom beads when working with different angles. And the best part is that now I have the skills I need to be able to work on the larger piece and go in with confidence. All right, before I forget, I would like to thank the Canada Council for the Arts for their very generous support in making this project possible. Thank you so much. I would like to thank my viewers, that would be you, for watching. And if you have any questions or comments, I would love to hear from you. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and I will catch you next time. Bye!